considering that movies, basically the big ones, are moved till next year, I wonder what this does for this year's like award nominees. I think there's going to be a lot of out of left field nominations or nominations from films that people have not seen.
And the fact that it's been officially pushed to April and the eligibility window has been extended to the end of February. So like the whole thing's been nudged back 2 months or nudged.
Oh, really? That kind of sucks.
So like movies can open in January and February that and still be eligible for the awards in April, which is new, obviously. But that means that there's probably going to be some studios that have had like their awards bait saved up and they'll just randomly drop it in January and February, hoping that like not only will it be eligible for the Oscars, but it could sort of maybe steal the show in a way from some of the titles that we were kind of hoping would rise up, like some of the indie stuff that.
I mean, we're in October already, November, December, and we'll have to see what comes out during that time because any of the prestige films will have to be released via streaming now. So if you had a movie that was prestige, but was basically lined up for a theatrical release, you're going to have to scramble or at least give up that hope.
I know that people in France got really upset about Cannes booking movies that were intended to be streaming only.
Right.
And there was a huge like fight over that.
Any film that's debuting at a film festival that was supposed to have a wider release, I can see why people get upset by it, especially if that wide release is completely scrapped.
Yeah, for sure. And you know, the French, are kind of purists when it comes to cinema anyway. So
yes. There's a big difference between movie and film in France. That's what makes it such a cultural landmark, though, because so many things seem to stem from Cannes.
Yeah.
And it's just held in such a high regard. So every little thing it does is just magnified. But
one day we will be big and famous enough and we'll get invites and we'll get to stroll the Riviera like Roger Ebert used to and like eating pastries and, seeing movies and being all tooty snooty about it.
Yeah. Okay. That's the long-term goal. Forget about monetization. We just want to get invited to Cannes.
Yeah. Start getting measured for our tuxes. All right. Well, on that note, let's start the show.
Welcome to episode 84 of the Extra Buttery podcast, a free-flowing conversation between two guys who love film and TV. My name is Jason Chen, and I'm joined by my co-host Robert Snow. Today, we're going to wrap up VIFF. We're going to finish off talking about The Boys. We're going to head into The Trial of the Chicago 7, Netflix's new legal drama from Aaron Sorkin. And we're going to also go into KAJILLIONAIRE, this new film starring Evan Rachel Wood. How are you doing, Rob?
I'm doing pretty good. How about you?
Good. So VIFF, sort of the last week, it ended before Thanksgiving, but we're just wrapping it up now because there were two films that were lined up at the very end of the festival that I had in-person showings for.
Right.
So the first one was Falling, which is Viggo Mortensen's directorial debut. I think this film is more interesting in terms of the production history behind it because it took him like 2-3 years to get the funding. When it had a bunch of troubles in pre-production, Viggo stepped in and he directed it, starred in it, wrote it, even wrote some of the music for it, which was very interesting, I thought.
He's a real multi-hyphenate, that's for sure.
Exactly. So, I mean, this is a guy who stayed in character as Aragorn when he kicked that orc head and broke his foot.
Yes.
So you can never really like question this guy's dedication to his craft or his art. And I think he really put a lot of effort into this. This is a very emotional drama between a gay son played by Viggo Mortensen and his misogynistic, homophobic father.
Did they know you were a fag in the army?
I didn't really know it myself. You can attack me all you want, but I am not going to engage with you on that level anymore.
And it's told mainly through flashbacks. So Viggo Mortensen, we meet him. He's already this full-grown man. He has a relationship with his boyfriend, who's a nurse. They have a daughter who I'm guessing is adopted. And his father is coming to Los Angeles to visit him because the farm that they grew up in New York is just too much work for an old man. So he's coming to LA to visit, maybe scope out a new place so he could live closer to his family. Except his dad is suffering from dementia. So there's that sort of added layer of complications to their father-son relationship. And so this movie, I think, is very much a talkie drama, except everything that comes out of Viggo Mortensen's dad's mouth is just either racist, homophobic, or sexist. And you kind of get why Viggo Mortensen is very patient, because after all, it is his father. But as an audience, you kind of can't wait to move past it. You're always waiting for this kind of like cathartic or moment of realization for the character where they finally, realize all the wrongs that they've done, all the stuff that they've done, and then they kind of turn over a new leaf. I don't think you really get that in this film, which is a very interesting artistic choice, because I think in these like melodramas, we're conditioned to get that moment. And in the final scene, there is like a big shouting match between Viggo Mortensen and his dad. But at the end of the day, at the end of the conversation, I don't think either character changes. So you sit through 2 hours of a bunch of, insults being hurled at each other, but to no real end. So I think that's where this film really falls apart.
So is there like an argument being put forth that there are some people like Mortensen's character's dad, the Lance Henriksen character, who are just irredeemable? Like no matter how patient you are, they're just never going to change. Is that kind of what the film is going at, or is that sort of like an unintended result?
I think there is that. The fact that people don't really change. I think the meat of the story is trying to understand why we put up with people like this in our lives. And so they make it a family relationship. There's a sister involved, and she likewise, Viggo Mortensen, gets insulted. Her two kids get insulted by the grandfather. If you can kind of separate yourself from the insults, it's kind of funny. But like I said, it gets a little much, and you don't exactly know where it's headed. Why Viggo Mortensen is so patient with his dad, even though he is, I'd say, probably one of the most toxic characters I've ever seen on film.
Oh, wow. Okay.
You never quite understand why Viggo puts up with it. Like he's self-sufficient. He's got a job. He's got a family. Doesn't really need his dad. So you never understood why he does the things he does. Considering that Viggo's character has been a victim of both mental and physical abuse. And I don't think the film does a really good job of explaining why he feels that way. So he might feel that way because his dad, helped him with something or did something really nice for him that he'll never forget. And you kind of do get those moments, but none of them are significant enough for the audience, us, to say, okay, I understand why Viggo Mortensen puts up with Lance Henriksen.
Right. I wonder if like all of the jobs that Mortensen took on on the set, like, all like he was writing it, he was composing music, he was directing, he was acting in it. Like sometimes what I've noticed about directorial debuts from actors is that they take on so much that they spread themselves a little bit too thin, and they don't really have time to kind of dedicate to one thing or another. Some people can pull it off, like they're just total like geniuses, and they can hit all the notes in a movie and still like do all these jobs. But maybe Mortensen was like, I don't know, maybe it just didn't come together. He couldn't follow every single thread. I
mean, I think there's maybe a point, there's some argument for that for sure. But a film that's been in production for 2-3 years, I kind of feel like all the plot and the characters are fleshed out as well as you can already. Obviously, sometimes it changes depending on who you cast. But I think Viggo is a much more talented music writer and actor than he is a writer. I think whatever he wanted to convey to the audience in regards to how the foundations of this father-son relationship, I don't think he quite got us there, the audience. Lance Henriksen starts off as a homophobic, misogynistic man, and he kind of ends the movie the same way. So Viggo doesn't really change either because, I mean, spoiler alert, but at the end of the movie, Lance Henriksen's character ends up moving back to New York. and sort of lives out the rest of his life there. So physically, metaphysically, spiritually, I don't think a lot of the characters change. There's just a very slice of life sometimes, because you get all these arguments that end up going nowhere, which I feel like may be a reflection of like, modern family dynamics where you're just like, no arguments go anywhere, but you kind of have the argument for argument's sake.
Yeah. And you're kind of like, you can't even remember how it started or like whether there's a point to it even ending. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But the better film I saw, and this is up there with that Japanese film that I told you about, My Dad's an Alcoholic. This is called Another Round. This is Thomas Vinterberg's film.
Right.
A Danish film that just recently won Best Award at the London Film Festival, I believe. Stars Mads Mikkelsen. The other three Danish guys I'm not familiar with at all, so I apologize. But it's a movie about 4 middle-aged school teachers who've become a little bored with life. So their marriages are just there. Their kids are there. Their jobs are there. And so they read about this philosopher who says that in order to get the most out of life, your blood alcohol level has to be at 0.05% at all times. So what happens is these 4 school teachers sort of make up a few rules about, when to drink and when not to drink. But the gist of the idea is that they go to school hammered.
Right.
Det er godt nok lang tid siden, jeg har haft det så godt, som jeg har det nu. Jeg tror bare, der er mere at hente der. Og måske endda lidt højere op. Så vi skifter gear.
And obviously, some of the characters take it a little too far. They drink a little too heavily. But the results are just like they run the entire spectrum. So there's plenty of good, and then there's plenty of bad. So in Mads Mikkelsen's case, he used to be this sort of robotic, disinterested history teacher, but once he's got a little buzz on, his classes become a lot more lively and dynamic, and his students love him for it. And so what happens is he starts to think that this is the answer to all his problems. And if you start going that road with alcohol, it generally doesn't end very well. But what you get is this like really heartwarming drama that's equal parts sad, frustrating, and really funny at times. And I would think that this is not on the level of like a Parasite or Shoplifters. Like there's nothing that groundbreaking about it, but it is a very, very solid film that I think that is very accessible to most people.
Well, it's definitely, I think it's like the 4th or 5th time that Vinterberg has teamed up with Mikkelsen on a movie together. I've watched, I think, at least 3, if not 4 of their previous collaborations. Although as far as I know, they haven't done that many comedies. So this one seems to have a bit more of a comedy tinge to it. And like
a little bit.
Like they did one where Mikkelsen played another school teacher in Denmark, but it was called The Hunt. And it was all about how he is the subject of a unfounded accusation of sexual assault, one of his young children that he takes care of. And then later on, Vinterberg made a movie where Mikkelsen plays I think it was like an 18th century doctor who gets caught up in this love triangle with like a countess or something. It was a period piece. Again, like very, very dark and stormy kind of stuff. And that seems to be like Vinterberg's kind of main mode. So the fact that he's got a bit more comedy in it, even though this is, like you're saying, more of a drama, is interesting to me because it feels like he's trying a few new things.
Yeah, well, like I think that's like sort of the case with alcohol, right? Like it could be really fun in sort of like a college frat sense. It could also be very devastating in terms of like when you start going down the road of alcoholism. I do think that even though there's this like one big tragic event in the movie, and I don't really want to spoil it, the movie ends on a really hopeful tone. And I think, yes, things go right and things go really wrong during their, experiment. But I think at the end of the day, all 4 characters, all 4 buddies find a new like vigor in life.
Yeah, well, that's definitely way more uplifting than some of the recent partnerships. So
yeah, I mean, like it's a really fine line, right? Like it could have ended so tragically and sort of basically flat out said, you know what, alcohol is bad. I'm kind of glad we avoided that sort of ending. And I kind of half expected that during midway through the movie, but it never went full evil, full dark side.
That's good. Well, I mean, I know that Vinterberg has a pretty like easy time selling his movies internationally in terms to like streaming services and stuff. So I have a feeling it ought to be pretty easy to find once the festival circuit is wrapped up.
Yeah, it should be. And I do recommend it. It's a fairly low budget film. There's only like two or three settings that you really venture to. So like the schoolyard, the houses, and that's basically it. It does kind of tie into the Danish culture of heavy drinking, which I kind of knew about, but didn't really quite know it was to this extent. I think in general, I think North American attitudes towards drinking are just a little different than Europeans.
Yeah, it's kind of like there's certain settings where it's very, very permitted, like, you know, at a wedding or like you were saying, a college frat. But then in terms of like this idea that these guys have of just like doing it nonstop throughout the entire day as this sort of like social experiment or something is definitely that would definitely feel weird to a mainstream North American audiences, I think.
Do you think you'd be better at your job if you're half drunk?
No, definitely not.
Or if you had a little buzz? No?
I've got too many There
are times where I think like, you know, maybe if I was a little buzzed, my job would be a lot more interesting. Not that it isn't interesting. It's just that it also adds just another layer to it, right? But I think there's difference between like drinking and operating machinery or doing something technical versus drinking and doing a job that's very much social.
Yes, and that's where I would fall apart because my job requires like video editing and playing around with fancy cameras and lenses and stuff. And if I was like dropping equipment and stuff, I wouldn't last very long, I don't think.
But wouldn't you think though that like if you got a little buzz and you're feeling a little tipsy and you played just a bit with the camera angle and the lens, that maybe something good might kind of come out of it, something new and like novel. Yeah. So I mean, there are times where, if I was a student or even a teacher, I wish some classes I went into drunk or tipsy. It'd be a lot more interesting for sure. Yeah. So I get where Vinterberg and the Danish people are coming from, but obviously, you know, I'm not going to, you know, encourage people to drink on the job or anything, but very interesting notion. Speaking of drunk, should we get into The Boys? Because wow, that was one wild ride.
Yes, well, we said we've covered it in the two previous episodes. We've been breaking it up into chunks, and the final episodes dropped about a week or so ago, and the slow burn kind of continued right up until the end. Like there was no real like. I guess you could say that the absolute like climax scene in the final episode was as blockbustery as they come so far on this show. They don't really get into like the really heavy duty superhero fights the way a Marvel movie would. But we finally did get a lot of payoffs to all of these like breadcrumb trails that have been sprinkled so far.
We can't just kill everyone.
That is exactly what we're gonna do.
We're even now. Holy. Why are you doing this? Because I want back in, so I need her gone.
They took Brian.
Don't you worry, I won't find your son.
I guess where's the best place to start? We could talk a little bit about the kind of the main conflict between Stormfront and Homelander and the boys and kind of that whole core bit.
Yeah, let's start with that actually.
Because like you had theorized that by the end of this season, Huey would have suffered some sort of mortal injury and he would need to be juiced up on the superpower causing Compound V. So that didn't end up happening. Huey was he kind of like he coasted a little bit through that injury.
He wasn't very important in the last episode.
No, it was more about it was more about like the girls in the episode.
Yeah, it was a very much girl power moment with Stormfront, right? What did you think of, like, knowing the whole story now, what did you think of Stormfront's arc?
Well, I feel like
I felt a little dissatisfied at the end.
I feel like it's not over. I think that like they've suggested that she's, even though she gets her ass handed to her in that final confrontation, she's still like technically alive. So she could be an influence in season 3.
Well, doesn't she have regenerative healing powers?
No, that's Kimiko.
But how does she survive all those like laser blasts from?
Oh, before she and Homelander start having sex?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess. Well, maybe she does have some sort of healing factor, but I don't think she can like.
I thought they all kind of.
She doesn't. I don't think she can like regrow limbs or anything like that, though.
Right.
So she might be like,
that we know of.
There might be some scene where like they go to see her in like a supervillain prison, and she's got like stumps, and she's just like sitting in a wheelchair, like screaming at them or something.
She feels too important in the Vought backstory to just last one season.
Yes. Yeah. I could even see them like coming up with a reason to give her like cybernetic arms and make her like this sort of.
Yeah. I mean, she in a lot of ways represents what Vought is, like personifies it. Right. So that's why Homelander also kind of left me a little wanting too.
The writers had sort of forced the two of them together in this and showed them as like two sides of the same kind of thirst for power. And then at the end, he's kind of sidelined in a sort of pathetic way. And he doesn't really have a whole lot of like, he doesn't really end the season with a goal or anything. He's just totally like,
no, he just kind of exists. Right. So after Carl Urban's wife is killed, spoiler alert, and the kid is survived, but the kid goes on to live with, or is given to Carl Urban to take care of.
Yeah, and then he sort of swiftly pairs him off with like, I guess,
some sort of like caretaker, right?
Yeah,
right.
Foster family or something.
Exactly. But Homelander just kind of accepts it, which I thought was very anti-Homelander considering how he conducted himself throughout the entire season.
Yeah, like
all of a sudden he kind of goes back into his little box of rules.
Yeah.
When before that he was openly trying to take control of Vought, trying to control his son's life. And then all of a sudden it just ends because the mother of the boy dies. Like, to me, that seems like an advantage to Homelander.
And Maeve blackmails him. Maeve finally pulls out that phone and says, like, I've got this.
What a long payoff for Maeve, though.
Yeah,
Jesus.
like
way to take your time, Maeve.
They really sprinkled that one like very thinly across the whole season. And it felt like there might have needed to be a little bit of extra dialogue in there to kind of incentivize Homelander to not, like, I don't know, fry the phone out of her hand or whatever, like,
or just to like kill the rest of the boys straight up.
She doesn't. Maeve says, like, if you don't leave these guys alone, I'm going to release this video. But like, she never says to Homelander, oh, I've got this thing backed up, so if you try to kill me, like, it'll still get out there.
Oh, like a dead man trigger type thing, right?
Yeah, she doesn't have anything like that she tells us about in that scene. So it sort of does feel like Homelander gives up without kind of exhausting all of his options.
Right. And I feel like Maeve's sort of plotline is a little underdeveloped. I think we all understand why she doesn't like the Seven and she wants to get out.
Yeah.
But it seems like her quest is very much on the back burner, more so than
even like the Deep and A-Train.
Yeah, I was going to say the Deep sort of subplot is more important than Maeve's revenge tour, basically.
I remember ending season 1 wishing that there was more Maeve stuff.
Yeah, she's really underused.
The show keeps suggesting that there's more going on, but doesn't really. It feels like a little bit hesitant to get into it. But then there they are, like with the Deep story, like they were stretching that one out and stretching that, and we finally get like I said, a payoff. But it's kind of classic Deep storyline payoff where it does connect to the main story, but it's also kind of a joke, which is sort of what I predicted like a few episodes ago, where
right, okay, yeah,
he's not really responsible for revealing Stormfront in a direct way. Only that he encouraged A-Train to join the Scientology cult thing. And then it was because the Deep did that A-Train was able to get access to the documents that then exposed Stormfront.
Right.
So like
right.
the Deep can sort of claim, but he doesn't know anything about that really. And he's kind of still an idiot. So,
well, also the Deep sort of his story is the one that kind of really ends on a cliffhanger, right?
Yeah.
So for the boys, it seems like maybe not their ultimate goal has been accomplished, but they do accomplish a goal and a really important goal.
Yeah.
And that is to basically destroy the Seven, expose Vought, and leave Homelander kind of like on his own. So the Deep, okay, all right, I guess it's funny to a point, but I'm still waiting for that one payoff. Like now that A-Train is back, I'm wondering how differently he is than before too, right? Or does he revert to the old A Train where, he's just back to his old, asshole ways?
Well, now that the head of the Scientology cult, what was it called, the Church of the Collective or whatever?
Yes.
He's had his head exploded by spoilers. Victoria Newman was the head exploder the whole time. The AOC analog. She's the mysterious person who keeps popping heads.
Right. Okay. So she's the big cliffhanger because they never solved that mystery, right? That was a crazy scene. That courtroom scene was awesome, though.
Classic boys gore, that was very much a classic playbook thing. So they've created a power vacuum in that Church of the Collective thing. So there's, I would say there's a pretty good chance that Deep becomes the new frontman for that whole thing, but he's going to be woefully inequipped for it. And he'll be trying to pretend to be this messiah figure. But
yeah, that's interesting. Actually, I can see the Deep being the villain by the end.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he's such a malleable character. I can see him going down that path. Whereas A Train has always been self-serving. So
yeah, you sort of feel like they're saving A Train for some bigger confrontation between him and Huey, where Huey will finally get to really screw him over for
kill him.
Yeah. So that maybe they're drawing that out a little bit. I saw one review though about the season where they were talking about how they didn't like how there was kind of an equivalency drawn between Stormfront's tactics and Victoria Newman's tactics, because it's almost like the show is saying, well, is the AOC analog any better or worse than Stormfront, considering that she, has this front of progressive kind of politics, but is actually just getting her way by exploding people in secret.
It's interesting because other than making Stormfront, the real villain of season 2, I don't think it tries to really commit itself politically either way.
Right.
I think it tries to be very middle of the road most times. The boys and the 7, they both have their faults and their ideas that are good or bad. Stormfront at the end, just the way things ended, the fact that she got beat up by 3 other superhero and just kind of gets fried to bits was very unsatisfying to me. I wish there was a bigger sort of ideological hammer that they could throw down.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, they kind of go the Quentin Tarantino route where it's here's this symbol of hate or whatever. We're going to kick this person's ass in a really epic way, set it to some pop song and make you feel really upbeat about someone.
Yeah, like you were saying, it's not quite Marvel, but it is Marvel in the sense that the bad guy just gets physically beat up. And even with the kid, the kid is very much apolitical, right? He has all these powers, but he's innocent and whatnot. Yeah. And I don't think the show really says anything about that kid either way either. They just kind of put it on the back burner for a little bit.
Yeah, they clearly want to maybe do a bit of a time jump before season 3 and then recast that kid as an older teenager who is more petulant or something, kind of like an Anakin Skywalker type thing.
So have you read the comics?
No, I know nothing about the comics. I'm just total speculation.
Okay, so after the season finale, I kind of went on Wikipedia and read about what happens in the comics. So
okay.
In the comics, Huey actually does get superpowers.
Oh, okay.
I don't know if that's ever going to happen in the show, though. It really feels like it probably won't, just given the way Huey is written and the dynamic that they have. But in the comics, Vought's attempt to basically control the world with all these superheroes ends up putting them at odds with the White House.
Oh, okay.
And in the comics, there's supposed to be this big showdown between the White House and the 7. And I wonder if that's where season 3 is going to go, where the political stakes kind of get kicked up a notch, where it starts involving the president of the United States.
Huey gets involved in the in Victoria Newman's congressional office or whatever, her campaign office. So he's going to have he'll be the window into that whole thing probably.
Yeah. And she, I think, is going to try and run for president one day. Right.
Right.
And in that way, she consolidates power and she can do whatever she wants. And so the challenge for the boys now is not only on the physical front, but on the political front, where you have this really public figure who is obviously a bad guy.
Yeah. And they're like, they certainly have like more rules over their head, because it's clear that like Butcher is going to take that offer of running as his like unit out in as like a black ops kind of government thing. You know, but even if it's black ops, he's still going to have to like keep Mallory happy in a way that he didn't really have to when he was a total freelancer. So there's going to be like some kind of conflict there where he wants to do something a really like brutal way, but he's not allowed. And
was there like a part of season 2 that you liked the most, that stood out the most? Good or bad? Not
in particular. I still think it's a bit of a potboiler kind of season. It's laying groundwork not only for like that confrontation in the final episode, but it feels like it's kind of in between things. I will say that final beat up scene is kind of just, it's kind of like popcorn entertainment, which is fun. And there's definitely not only like the allusions to things like Inglourious Bastards or Once Upon a Time in Hollywood in terms of like taking this hateful character and beating them up. It also is a huge call out for me to Death Proof.
Okay.
Where right. 3 badass women beat up a hateful kind of villain character and set it to pop music. So I kind of appreciate it. I was like, all right, cool. This show has some like...
That girl power moment, I think, is way better than that moment in Infinity War.
Yes.
Part 2.
Or Endgame.
Where like all the female superheroes kind of like rush to the screen.
Yeah, they just pose.
And there's this like superhero, and they kind of pose there. I thought the boys did it much better if you were going to make a message about that.
Yeah.
I'm kind of like you. I don't have like a particularly memorable moment from season 2, except maybe for the sperm whale when they run the boat right through it.
Right.
To me, that's just like classic The Boys, where it's totally just ridiculous in terms of what gets destroyed, what happens, and the amount of like fake blood that goes into this.
I've been on the set of The Boys, and they...
Oh, have you?
Yeah, not like the actual fun spot where any of the stars were, but I've like been on the back lot where they were working on costumes and stuff.
Oh, cool.
And, I didn't see any buckets of blood lying around, so clearly I wasn't where the real fun stuff was happening.
Yeah, no. I did think that if Homelander didn't steal the show in season 1, he definitely does in season 2.
Yeah, he really takes center stage here, like, yeah, with Madeline still well out.
Yeah, and just his performance, like, there's so much, like, ambiguity with Anthony Starr. Whenever he smiles or does anything, really, you never quite know what his end goal is or what his actual intentions are.
Yeah.
Whereas in season 1, Carl Urban's like this guy with a sledgehammer, right?
Yeah.
But in season 2, he kind of really takes a back seat, and Homelander runs the show. Stormfront was a very good foil for him, even though they end up teaming up together.
Yeah, I want to see Anthony Starr get like...
He would make a good Bond villain, I was going to say.
Yeah, I was going to say like not just any Bond villain, but like Bond could have one of his rare adventures in America, and Anthony Starr could play like a crazy alt-right white supremacist type who...
Which is crazy because he's not even American, eh?
Exactly, but he's like... I mean, maybe I'm being... That's being colored a little bit too much by his work here, and like, you know, how he's kind of flirting with alt-right type of ideas in this character, but...
Well, I guess I don't know the sag between The Boys and Trial of the Chicago 7.
There's not really one. other than
maybe like the political stuff. But even then, that's a hard sort of like jump because...
Yeah, I mean, they're both on streaming. We got that.
Yeah, true. But I was just going to start off with, what did you think of Trial of the Chicago 7?
Well, honestly, I didn't know a whole lot about it going in, other than it was like Netflix's prestige movie of the fall. Like, obviously,
like you didn't know about the historical background or the movie itself?
No, I know. I did not. I'd never heard of the Chicago 7 before this. I knew that there had been riots in Chicago in 1968. But I didn't really know the people involved or like what criminal cases came out of it. I was totally in the dark about that.
We're going to Chicago to protest the Vietnam War.
And there's no place to be right now but in it.
We watched for a decade while these rebels without a job tell us how to prosecute a war. Well, they're going to spend their 30s in a federal facility, real time.
I knew enough about the way Netflix was kind of positioning this movie to kind of see it as like, this is their awards bait movie for the fall, especially considering that so many other awards-bait things are being pushed.
Right.
So that was kind of the vibe I was getting from it going in. And it's been a while since I've seen a movie that was like begging for Oscars so hard.
Well, it is an Aaron Sorkin movie, and you know what you're going to get.
Yes, but I feel like even though I liked Aaron Sorkin's last directorial work in Molly's Game, I thought that was a very solid, very entertaining movie. This one, it has so many Sorkinisms, and they're like fleetingly good. You get that kind of like endorphin rush where you're like, yeah, but then you think of like more than 30 seconds about it, and you're like, actually, that scene was just kind of hollow.
Wait. So are you saying that Sorkin didn't push enough Sorkinism into this film? That's why it's not as good as you think?
Yeah.
Because I think too much of Aaron Sorkin is not always a good thing.
He was a bit restrained in Molly's Game, I think, because he had a smaller budget. He had a good cast, but he had like a more restrained story to tell. And
you think so? I feel like the pace in Molly's Game is just breakneck.
The actual like implications of the story were pretty minimal. Like it was just like her story. You know, he wasn't trying to tell this like epic sweeping thing about America.
Oh, okay. Yes. Okay.
The movie is like packed with this ensemble cast who are all like great actors in their own rights. And a lot of them are doing great work, but you never get to know any of the characters really. It feels like they're all kind of stealing the oxygen from each other in the scenes. And I ended up at the end of it, I was like, okay, fine. Like it's a good story, but I feel, and American audiences won't really understand this reference, but it felt a little bit like a Heritage Minute to me, which is, you know, there's a series of like, they're like 60-second PSAs or little tidbits of history that air on Canadian TV. They still make them. I grew up with them on like, you know, the national broadcaster and stuff. And they were able to like condense famous historical moments into a 60-second little mini drama thing. And I feel like you could make a Heritage Minute out of this and come away just as informed about the story, you know. I don't, but that's just me. Like, what did you think?
So I kind of agree and disagree with you there. I think for whatever reason, this film is really polarizing. I've seen really great reviews for this film, and I've seen some really bad, like thumbs down reviews for this film. I get what you're saying about the characters, but to me, that's always been like a sort of trap of an ensemble film.
Yeah. Is
that you don't always get to know all the characters very well. I like the pacing of this a little better because Molly's Game and The Social Network, sometimes things just move way too fast. Where like he has this real problem with allowing scenes and bits of dialogue to breathe. And I don't think he has that problem here because I think there's a bit of like a physical comedy to this. Part of it coming from Frank Langella as Judge Hoffman. I get that historically and like in real life that he wasn't a particularly popular judge, but he becomes very much a caricature.
Yeah. Yeah.
And same with the inclusion of Michael Keaton too, right? Where like it's not even a role he plays; it's a cameo almost.
Yeah, but it's such it does inject the movie with certain kind of life that it really need at that point in the story. But before we go too far, maybe we should actually explain like the story that's covering it. Cause like I said, I didn't know anything about it and I'm like relatively read up on my history, but
okay.
So the Chicago 7, they were a group of,
they're all different groups, Robert. Come on now.
Well, true. Yes. They do have a whole scene dedicated to that. But they were a sort of a loosely affiliated group of people who had all traveled to Chicago in 1968 to organize protests in the environment of the Democratic National Convention. And we have like a couple of guys from a student organization. They're headed by Tom Hayden, who's played by Eddie Redmayne. Then we've got a kind of hippie-ish group called the Yippies. They're led by two guys played by Sacha Baron Cohen and Jeremy Strong. Then we have one guy on his own who's sort of heading up his own like non-violent organization called MOBE.
He's a pacifist.
Yeah, he's a pacifist, played by John Carroll Lynch, who I always like. Then we have a Black Panther who's kind of tossed in at the last minute. He didn't really have a whole lot to do with the actual violence that took place in Chicago, but he's sort of tossed into the group. And then there's a smattering of like other affiliated guys in each of those groups to fill out the total number of defendants. And the government is contending that like these guys all came to Chicago. They organized ahead of time and they planned to do a riot. They planned to attack the police and cause all this violence. And of course,
right, because they crossed state lines.
Yeah. And then, of course, the defendants, the defense attorneys, led by Mark Rylance's character,
William Kunstler.
William Kunstler. It's the defense attorney's job to prove that they were there for nonviolent purposes. So then the trial takes place over, it covered like, what was it, 120 days or something? It was a long running trial.
6 months, something like that.
We check in. We don't follow it like exhaustively. We skip there. It skips forward in time at certain points. And we get a few flashbacks to the events of the actual convention and the various outbreaks of violence over the course of that weekend. So it's pretty, like, the movie is pretty traditionally put together. Like there's no like, I think so. There's no like fancy flourishes with editing or cinematography or anything. It's pretty straightforward.
This is like a Sorkin thing where he uses a lot of flashbacks.
Yeah.
To tell the story. The one thing about Sorkin I like though is that the flashbacks are always placed very well within the movie.
Yeah.
So it's edited very well. So the flashbacks always make sense and they call back to the present moment.
Yeah. So the flashbacks, they don't like rob any kind of energy from the main story being told. So that's fine. And to be clear, like I didn't hate this movie. I'm kind of in like a 3 star out of 5 kind of range. Like I appreciate a lot of the performances. I appreciate the writing. It felt a little bit too
vanilla
by the book. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So,
and a little bit too grubbing for Oscars. Like it feels like, you know, here's your big moment where Eddie Redmayne's going to be nominated. And here's your big moment where Mark Rylance is going to get nominated again.
Well, because this was supposed to be a Steven Spielberg film.
Oh yeah. You can feel that for sure.
But either way, I get what you're saying about this is very kind of Oscar baity, but I also think it's very harmless Oscar bait.
Yeah.
I think it's a very well acted, well directed, well written movie. It's never going to knock your socks off. I do think in a way it is kind of forgettable in that maybe in 10 years we'll forget about this legal drama because I feel like that genre is way too crowded. And it doesn't really do anything to stand out.
Well, there's a reason why they kind of died out there back in the 2000s. Like courtroom dramas were like all the rage in the 90s and before that. And then for some reason, it was just the market taste just sort of shifted. And yeah, we haven't seen many of them in the past couple of decades.
And I think of all the films that have made really strong political statements in our current environment, this is one of the more tame ones. And I think you can see that with the way they treated Tom Hayden's character, where the rest of the people who are being accused of conspiracy are very anti-establishment. They really don't like the judge. But Tom Hayden still has this sort of reverence for the institutions and the government that he's trying to basically bring down or accuse of wrongdoing. I think that he very much personifies this movie. And I don't think I've ever seen a film where you don't want to punch Eddie Redmayne in the face. And so I get where people are coming from. But like I said, in this year where I do think there is a shortage of, you know, really high profile prestige films, I think this is a film that could sneak into the awards. But in any other year, I agree with you. I don't even think this is Aaron Sorkin's best film. I think Social Network and Molly's Game are way better.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. And like it also feels like Netflix probably could have waited in a normal year. They probably could have maybe put more of a theatrical push behind it and make a bigger deal about it. But it feels like they're sticking to keeping it at this particular release date because it's like 2 to 2.5 weeks until the US election. There's a lot of imagery in this that calls back to some stuff that's happened this year with like the George Floyd, Black Lives Matter protests, things like you see the cops like removing their name tags and their badges before they go in to like beat on the protesters. Very like eerily familiar imagery. The message of the movie also feels like kind of targeted at the modern day Democratic Party because people often say that the Democratic Party in the States is a big tent party where you've got all of these little factions that are all like very different flavors of leftism that are all fighting for influence in a big party. And the only way that they ever get elected is if they can get all of these very different people who are all kind of lumped together in this one big tent to agree to work together. And it feels like they're having the same problems now that they did back then. So it feels like the movie is trying to say like, hey, wake up. Like we got to all come together. Look at all what these random misfits had to band together on 50 years ago. It's happening again today.
Yeah. I was going to just kind of jump on that point is that anytime you see an Aaron Sorkin film, you know right away which party he belongs to.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I think it is very, very clear. This is very much I don't want to say left wing because that has a bit of a negative term these days.
Yeah.
But it's very clear that it is making a commentary about the people's right to overthrow government if they feel like the paths to change that were open to them are being unjust or unfair. I actually came in a little higher than you. I was kind of 3.5, 4, flirting with 4. In a good mood, I think I give it a 4 because you know what you're going to get and it delivers. And I think for me, that's always a sign of a good film, is that regardless of politics, regardless of what you think the director or is trying to say politically, if the acting is good, directing is good, story is good, and it's engaging, I think that's a good film. And that's what Aaron Sorkin films usually try to do, is they frame these things in a sort of leftist point of view, but still make it very dramatic and engaging. And I think with historical events like these, and even with The Social Network, he obviously has a lot of creative license. I don't think we're going to get the full story here, but it is very well done. It's a very well told story.
This does inject a lot of levity and humor and stuff into what could be a pretty depressing, dragged out kind of story. He keeps it light for the people who may not be hardcore history buffs. Although I have to say, even though I like him more than you do by probably a considerable margin, I was kind of bummed out that Joseph Gordon-Levitt was so boring in this.
Yeah, I loved how he played a government nobody, even though Schultz, the lawyer he plays, Richard Schultz, ends up to being one of the most prominent figures in this trial in American history in that regard. You know that last scene where he stands up when Thomas Hayden's reading the list of the people who died in Vietnam?
Yes.
I wonder if that's a creative choice by Sorkin and JGL to showcase that side of Richard Schultz, because in real life post-trial interviews, Schultz has always come across as this really hardline Republican. He was convinced that those protesters in Chicago were up to no good, that they were there to incite violence.
So it's almost like they play a little bit of fast and loose with the character. They kind of try to make him to be the bridge between the lefties in the movie and the super oppressive Republican types.
And I think this is a very Sorkin thing, where the bad guys aren't always the bad guys. They're just good people who are being ruled or controlled by bad things.
Yeah, that was 100% Jeff Daniels' character in The Newsroom. He makes this big speech about being a Republican, right, and the Republican Party has been dragged down by bad influences, and there's a version of republicanism that can be good, and all this stuff. That was there was three seasons of TV devoted to that idea.
So as much as Aaron Sorkin likes to throw haymakers in political statements, he never really throws them hard.
Yeah.
Even Judge Hoffman, who is supposed to represent everything that's bad about the establishment, he comes off as way too sort of comedic to be taken seriously anyway.
Cranky grandpa kind of thing.
Right. So I think it's actually nice that Sacha Baron Cohen was his immediate foil.
Yes.
Because it really shows you that you're not supposed to take their sort of back and forth, their animosity towards each other seriously. One obviously represents the justice system, and the other one represents sort of the counterbalance to it.
Yes, yeah.
And so Aaron Sorkin, I think, was very aware that he had to give them both equal weight.
No, that's fair. And like I said, I don't hate the movie. Just maybe it caught me at the wrong time. Maybe if I was watching this when the U.S. election wasn't right around the corner, I would feel differently. I'd be curious to kind of to kind of test that out in maybe a couple of years' time.
Yeah, definitely. I think it chose the right release date.
So maybe we'll close things out with a totally different movie, although still sort of about like what ails America, I guess would be the best segue.
I was so looking forward to this.
And you should still check it out. I watched this yesterday. It's called Kajillionaire, directed by Miranda July. And it's a little indie movie, only like an hour, 40 minutes, about this family of scammers living in LA. And these are like the worst people that, or at least certainly the mother and father are, the husband and wife. We've got Richard Jenkins and Deborah Winger, who play Robert and Teresa.
She's great too.
And they've raised this daughter, played by Evan Rachel Wood, who's named Old Dolio. That's OLD space DOLIO. And the reason why Evan Rachel Wood's character is named Old Dolio is a pretty funny joke. It's been spoiled in a few reviews. So, I mean, it's kind of easy to spoil it for yourself, but I think the reveal is worth saving for this moment. But together they're this 3-person family unit, and they just sort of like kind of wander around LA, and they just try to find the absolute cheapest, most underhanded ways of getting through life.
She learned to forge before she learned to write. Well, actually, that's how she did learn to write.
My favorite movies are the Ocean 11 movies. This is exactly the kind of thing that I've been wanting.
So what do your parents do, hon? Hon, you've never called me that. But you could if it was a job, though, right?
And they've set themselves up with this cheap rent in a abandoned office storefront area next to a bubble factory. And they've got this thing set up where the owner of the bubble factory has this defect in his factory where the bubbles, like the soapy suds, keep leaking through the wall into the office area. And in order to not get caught by the city and shut down, he has the main characters of this movie sort of living in there and scooping the soap suds off the wall and dumping it in like a sort of a futile attempt to keep the wall from collapsing. They don't make enough money to really afford the rent in this wacko kind of setup that they have going on. So they're just always like scouring around, like trying to steal mail from people's post office boxes.
So like what's the main sort of conflict, the main rub of the plot?
Well, basically the guy who owns the bubble factory says, look, you are $1,500 behind on the rent. You owe me 3 months rent. You have to pay me in 2 weeks or I'm kicking you out. And they don't have the money. They have no means of getting $1,500. So they end up listening to Old Dolio, who dreams up this idea of them going on a plane together she manages to like win 3 return tickets in some sort of like online sweepstakes to New York and back. So their idea is to take the flight to New York, fly immediately back to LA, and then pretend like they lost one of their suitcases and report it to the airline and use the traveler's insurance to get the $1,500 because like they'll pretend like they lost the bag, but they really didn't. Through pulling off this con, they cross paths with a character named Melanie, played by Gina Rodriguez, she presents herself as being like an ophthalmologist's assistant, but it turns out that she's also in this kind of shady sort of world where she's not pulling off the kind of scams that Evan Rachel Wood or Richard Jenkins' characters are, but she's kind of interested in it. She sort of wants to get into that sort of mostly just for the thrill of it. So she joins their group and tries to help them get the $1,500 together.
Right.
And they end up kind of just stumbling around, finding like that they find themselves in the home of like a dying man, and they try to like steal his checkbook. And it's just a very like the whole movie is just a very idiosyncratic kind of strange little story about misbegotten, terrible people. And yet you find yourself rooting for Evan Rachel Wood and Gina Rodriguez's characters because you see how toxic the relationship is between Old Dolio and her parents, and how their kind of lifestyle of just scamming people and never really forming a real family has totally screwed up Old Dolio. It's made her like completely terrified of any kind of like emotional attachment. She doesn't even want to be like physically touched. Like she's had no kind of nurture in her life whatsoever. It's all about the scams. So you end up cheering her on as because she sort of discovers herself and sees how poisonous her parents are.
And Evan Rachel Wood is kind of cast against type for this movie,
yeah,
isn't she?
Because, normally she plays like very intellectual characters or sort of like airy kind of...
I always feel like she plays really serious characters.
Yeah, and she's been playing this robot on Westworld for the past few seasons, and
right.
that's she's done great work on that. I watched the first season of that. But here she's doing this thing where like her hair is going down to her knees because her character never gets a haircut. She's wearing these like baggy athletic jackets and pants, and she's speaking in this very.
It's like me.
Speaks in this like low register where like she's speaking like 2 octaves below what her actual speaking voice is.
The title itself is very interesting. So Kajillionaire is always a term you sort of say when you want to be, rich beyond your dreams, right?
Yes.
Where like the number is so big that there's no number attached to Kajillionaire. It doesn't really mean anything.
Yeah.
So in that sense, you get the feeling that the characters in this film probably aren't that highly educated, that they're striving to reach a level of wealth that may not exist for them or exist in this universe. So in what ways, like what does Kajillionaire really refer to?
Well, they are the furthest thing from rich. Like they can barely afford to put food in their mouths. Like they are almost homeless. And so for them, like Kajillionaire could be like somebody who works at McDonald's. And then it's funny how partway through the movie, they do some of their scams start paying off. And then immediately the temptation to spend big chunks of their winnings on stupid things like a hot tub that they can't even install in this terrible little office that they live in. It's so incongruous that you just can't help but laugh, even though it's really depressing. The actual term Kajillionaire pops up in one bit of dialogue. Richard Jenkins is talking about like, oh, well, not everyone can be Kajillionaires. He's saying that as if like with the tone of somebody who's like middle class. That again, like the incongruousness of it is just super funny. I hadn't seen any of Miranda July's movies before now. I'd heard her name pop up in like the indie film circles. She made a movie called The Future back in like 2011. I remember there was a really, really weird trailer for that involved like a puppet cat or something. And this strange voice. And Miranda July also, she starred in that movie. So she's been making like little movies this whole time, but this feels like the first time in a while that she's had like recognizable people join in the cast, and like, people like Evan Rachel Wood, Richard Jenkins. They're not like top of the totem pole, but they're recognizable names.
I think even with no movies in theaters, I like this challenge of trying to find movies.
Yeah, you do have to put a bit of effort into it.
Yeah, and usually when we go to the movies, it's because there's been this big movie that's impressed upon us. The entire MCU feels that way, in that if you don't see an MCU film, you are missing out on a piece of cultural history.
Yes.
And I think it kind of peer pressures you that way. But I like where we're at now, where you have the freedom to really go out and search for the things you want. And because there hasn't been, as much advertising and publicity, you never quite know what you're going to get, which I really kind of appreciate these days.
It's a little bit of the film festival experience.
Yeah, I've gotten to the point where I like going into films blind.
I mean, I guess it's a fun time. It's also a sad time. It's because
hopefully not too sad for our listeners, I think that does it for this episode.
Yeah. And like Jason said, we're probably going to do a bit of an awards look at some point in the next few months to kind of look ahead and sort of see where the conversation about the awards race is, because it's going to be a different one this year.
That's right. So if you want to check out our website, it's www.kinetoscope.ca. You can find us on Twitter as well, KinetoscopeCA, J. Robert Snow and Jason Chen 16. From Vancouver, my name is Jason Chen.
And coming to you from Toronto, my name is Robert Snow. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.